I hope you enjoyed Thanksgiving. For me, it's always time to see family in Pennsylvania and talk politics and take stock of the year. And here at this table, we will do just that tonight, take stock of President Trump and impeachment, days after the latest round of public hearings concluded. Joining me are two of the nation's brightest minds on this front. Jon Meacham, a Pulitzer Prize-winning presidential biographer, celebrated journalist and editor, and contributor to Time. We'll talk with Jon a little later. But first, Maggie Haberman, a Pulitzer Prize-winning White House correspondent for the New York Times and CNN political analyst. She has covered President Trump with vigor and a keen eye for many years, going back to his days in New York. Maggie, welcome back to Washington Week.
Thanks for having me.
Maggie, when you think about President Trump and cover him at this moment, this juncture in his presidency, do you see him employing many of the same tactics he used to use in New York when you were reporting on him then?
I do, Bob. He is doing the Donald Trump playbook. This has been what he's doing with impeachment. Some folks have compared it to what he did during the probe by special counsel Robert Mueller, which was essentially, hammer away at the facts, argue that they're not true, argue that people are out to get him, throw up enough dust around everything that people were sort of confused, and insist that he had done nothing wrong. And that did turn the dial somewhat on public opinion before that report came out. And then after it came out, it just sort of disappeared. This is not just a tactic that he used with Mueller. This is a tactic he has used his entire life. His entire business life, his political life, his real estate life has all been about bending other people to his will. And I think you are going to see that now, where he is using some combination of blunt force and, typical Washington wooing with Republican lawmakers to try to keep them on his side.
Speaking to that point about bending the Republican Party to his will, how does he see that dynamic with his own party? Why does he believe there is so much continuing loyalty within the GOP?
I think that he attributes it to a couple of things, but the main one is that the Republican establishment still, I think, has not quite come to grips with being caught totally off guard in 2016 by his rise and then by his win. You have Republican members of Congress, both in the House and in the Senate, who aren't quite sure where their voters are, but who know that they do have a sizable portion in their districts and in their states of Trump voters, and they do not want to alienate them. They know that that is a real risk. They know it's a real risk if the president then tweets about them, and they know it's a real risk if the president attacks them publicly. And so none of them want to earn his ire. I think all of this is why you are seeing enduring loyalty. I do think from Republicans I've spoken to that a number of them have genuinely come to agree with him, that they think that the way that this inquiry is being conducted by House Democrats is not fair or is not proper or is not sticking to practices done in previous impeachment inquiries, bearing in mind we've had only 3 others in the nation's history. But they're very frustrated by the fact that they can't question witnesses or call their own witnesses in the same way that Democrats can.
When you look back at your time reporting on President Trump, going up to Trump Tower, that 26th floor office, him making calls, has this impeachment process revealed that way he operates outside of the chain of command, talking to people like Rudy Giuliani or Roy Cohn or Michael Cohen?
Look, I think that everything about this presidency, Bob, has been some version of revealing that he has never changed his MO from the time that he was at Trump Tower, where everything was sort of boiled down, reductionist with him at the top, and then a bunch of orbits around him that only he really knew what was going on. You've seen the same thing with the White House. He does not believe in following typical White House protocol. He does have all kinds of outside lines. I think that when he was first elected, there were a lot of questions, certainly that I had, about whether he would try to outsource certain functions still either to his company or to aides who worked for his company. We haven't seen any evidence of that, but we do know that he has invoked people like Rudy Giuliani and deployed them on these missions in terms of trying to find, as it's been described, as dirt against the Biden family. There are other areas where he has outsourced pieces of the government, whether it was at the VA involving some members of his club, Mar-a-Lago, and Florida, who had managed to get their hands in there. I think that we may see other instances of this as the next year or possibly 5 years progress.
He turns to Rudy Giuliani at times for help on foreign policy, but who's he turning to inside of this White House, inside of his cabinet, as he faces impeachment? Who's influential right now?
So it's interesting because so many of the people who have been influential in the last year are also people who are proximate to this inquiry as subjects themselves, or at least as witnesses themselves. The two people who he has trusted the most over the last year have been Bill Barr, the Attorney General, and Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. Pompeo certainly is all caught up in this because of the work that Giuliani was doing. Giuliani has repeatedly tried to, throw attention back Pompeo's way or back the State Department's way. And I think that that has created some tension between Pompeo and the president. The president's not really sure who he can trust right now. He's been relying very heavily on Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel. But in general, there are not a number of trusted aides around him anymore.
But is there a war room inside of this White House or not?
Yes and no. There is a war room that is not called a war room. There is a couple of officials who were hired in the last couple of weeks, maybe month at this point, on the direction of Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law. And we should note the president tends to get very burrowed into his family in times of stress, and this is no exception. Jared Kushner is basically running the impeachment battle plan for the president. He instructed the White House to hire Tony Sayag, a former aide at the Treasury Department, and Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, who's a favorite of the president's on television, defending him. Now, they have been running not a conventional war room in the sense that they're not pushing a lot of things out publicly. There's not a ton taking place on television. The president is still his own best public-facing messenger, as far as I can tell. But what they are doing is a lot of coordinating of communications with the Hill. They are doing a lot of daily meetings, making sure they're on the same page, and that is new.
Does he ever grapple with the charges against him on Capitol Hill with concerns about his own conduct, or is this a president who remains unchanged and really unwilling to examine his own behavior?
Self-reflection is not really one of his familiar suits, I would say, if not strong suit. I've seen no indication, or heard no indication, that he is thinking that he did anything wrong in how he handled this Ukraine matter, whether it was the military aid that he put a freeze on, or the call that he had with President Zelensky of Ukraine on July 25th. In fact, he's been very frustrated for several weeks that Republicans had been fighting this on process grounds, that they had been arguing that the impeachment process itself was unfair, but not really delving into the question of his conduct on that call. He wants people saying he did nothing wrong, and that is part of why the notion of a Senate trial does appeal to him on some level. He likes the idea of being able to bring out witnesses to say he didn't do anything wrong, which would be contrary primarily to what we saw in the House inquiry.
So much of what happened with that phone call with President Zelensky was driven by the 2020 Democratic presidential race, Vice President Biden. When he looks at that race right now, and he sees the entry of Mayor Bloomberg from New York, he sees Biden still doing okay in the polls, he sees Mayor Buttigieg rising. What's his own understanding of that contest?
It's interesting about his understanding of that contest tends to relate, as most things do for him, back to himself. So he's been very surprised that he has not permanently destroyed Joe Biden. He's been very surprised that he did not permanently destroy Elizabeth Warren. And he has said both of those things to people. He still thinks that Biden is somebody who would be an easier opponent for him. Bloomberg is something of an X factor. He has I wouldn't say a friendship with Bloomberg, but they certainly know each other from New York days. Bloomberg took a lot of whacks at him in the 2016 presidential race at the Democratic convention, as you remember. And Bloomberg, most significantly, has a much larger bank account, and that is something that gets in this president's head. This president knows that Bloomberg can spend in ways that this president, frankly, never could, even as a self-funder, and never would, most likely. He tends to resort to using other people's money in that kind of situation. But Bloomberg is running as something totally different, and Bloomberg is going to talk about jobs. The only other person in the presidential campaign that you hear really talking about jobs as a message across the board is Donald Trump right now. Mike Bloomberg's ad focused on the word jobs pretty aggressively, and the president knows this. His aides are hoping he will not be baited into a back and forth with Bloomberg, which will only serve to elevate Bloomberg as a general election candidate.
So what's next, Maggie? You've studied him, you've reported on him. Is it constant war, political war between now and November 2020? What's the strategy? What's the end game?
Well, the end game is winning. The strategy, I think, is an open question because, as you know, he tends to treat the world in terms of dealing with the 10-minute increments of time that he has to get through. And so right now the increment of time that he has to get through is the impeachment inquiry, and that is where his focus is. I think what you are going to see, if what we expect happens, if there is no further information that comes out, if there are no additional witnesses, and there could be, but if all things stay as they are, the anticipation is that he is in all likelihood going to be impeached in a House vote and then be acquitted in a Senate trial. And then I think you are going to see a very, very angry President Trump campaigning over what he feels like he went through this year. I always go back, my framework for this is that weekend, that Access Hollywood tape weekend, October 7th to October 9th, 2016, where he was suffering one of his worst ever wounds of any kind when that tape came out. And his response was to go to the debate in St. Louis against Hillary Clinton and just savage her by forcing her to walk across a parade of women who had accused her husband of sexual improprieties or, in one case, rape. I think that you can expect that next year is going to be ugly.
Grievance, politics, and political warfare. Maggie, as insightful as ever, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.